1986, Annie and Jessica Andrews, who are teenage sisters, unfortunately lose their mother to cancer. It was a relatively abrupt death. It caught the family by surprise, and so following her death, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian Andrews. Now, Brian worked a lot, but with the death of his wife, he had to work even more to make sure he was bringing home enough of an income to provide for his two daughters. Annie and Jessica were hit very hard by the loss of their mother. They were very close with her, and with their father being gone so much, those two were left alone a lot at the house and left alone with their thoughts, and they missed their mom. And so one night when Brian was out at work, the girls decide to use a Ouija board and to try to contact their mother. And they would even admit that they didn't really expect anything to happen. They just wanted some sort of connection to their mother, who they missed terribly. So they went down in the basement, they got out the Ouija board, and they have like a seance. They didn't really do much research into how to do it or what to do. They basically just started, kind of asking if their mother was here, could she give them some sign? And so they have this kind of Ouija board seance, and nothing comes of it. Brian is not home for this. Their father's not home, and it's just those two. And after, a couple of hours of doing this seance, they ultimately put it away. And in a way, it was kind of a cathartic experience that they got to, think about their mom really intently and kind of think maybe she could be with them right then. And in many ways, the seance was a success because it made them feel closer to their mom, even if it was just for a moment and if it was artificial. So they put the Ouija board away, and the girls go upstairs, and they're kind of having a low-key night, and ultimately decide to go to bed. Now, their father has not come home yet, so just the girls. They're used to this. This is how a lot of nights went. And as they're laying in bed, they both start hearing tapping sounds. Now, they're in separate rooms, and they heard the same tapping sounds. And in fact, Jessica would get up and come into Annie's room and say, "Hey, do you hear that tapping sound on the walls?" And Annie's like, "Yeah, I hear it too." And they're listening, and there's silence, and they hear this kind of like tapping sound in the walls. They didn't know what it was. They'd never heard it before. And the girls, again, they miss their mother so terribly, and they were basically hoping that it was their mom. They knew it couldn't be, but they were hoping it was. And so they're like, "It's Mom. Mom's trying to get in touch with us. She's making sounds to get in touch with us. It's from the seance. It must have worked." And they start asking their mother questions like, "Are you here with us right now? And can you show yourself to us? And are you looking after us?" Just like questions that you would imagine people might ask if they thought the ghost of a loved one was in the room with them. And so it was scary, but it was also kind of reassuring that you have what they believed to be the spirit of their mother looking out for them. And when their father finally came home that night, the tapping at this point had stopped, and they rushed to tell their father about the tapping they heard. And they were happy about it. They weren't scared about it. They were happy about it. And Brian, he's worked all day, and he's grieving the loss of his wife, and he thinks that his daughters are making it up, especially because they told him about the Ouija board. And he's just thinking to himself, they're grieving. They're struggling with the loss of their mother. They're grieving. And, he felt really bad for them. And he even considered that first night putting them into therapy. Not because he was upset with them or anything, but because he's like, this is a manifestation of grief. But he ultimately said, "Look, guys, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for us. Go to bed. We'll talk about this tomorrow." And so the girls went back to their rooms. Brian didn't think much of it. He was just thinking, should I bring the girls to grief counseling, something like that. And everybody goes to bed. Now, this tapping would persist for several days. The tapping got so frequent that it actually started disturbing the girls' sleep. And every time they would yell to their father to come in and check, the tapping would stop. And so it was like kind of driving them crazy. And then when they would all leave the house during the day, in the evening, whenever, anytime the house was empty. And so they would come back to the house, and things would be moved, furniture would be moved slightly out of position. Some of the silverware had been moved around, just little things all over the house. And Annie and Jessica's father is quick to say, "Guys, I know this is you. I know you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real, that you want your mom to be here with us right now, but she's not. And you got to stop this whole ghost thing. You got to stop moving the furniture around. This is not healthy. If this continues, I am going to ask that you guys start seeing a grief counselor." And the girls were insistent that it was not them. And the fact that their father didn't believe them and they knew it wasn't them, it put them in a really bad spot because they felt totally alone, scared to be in their house, because now it didn't really feel like their mother. It felt like something screwing with them. And that's not something their mother would do. And so they're thinking that this is like an evil ghost that they've unlocked through that Ouija board seance. And it's now terrorizing them. And there's nothing they can do because their father doesn't believe them. And it's just consistently happening. They don't know what to do. One evening in January of 1987, the girls were together in the front room of their house, and they started hearing tapping sounds again. And so they hear this tapping sound not coming from the walls, but coming from the basement. And suddenly they feel, some confidence, like they're going to go down and confront this thing because their father doesn't believe them. They don't know what to do, so they're just going to go face this thing head on. So they head right downstairs into the basement, and there's nothing. The tapping stops as soon as they're down there, and they can't find anything. As they turn to go back upstairs, feeling a little bit silly that they're going to go fight this ghost, they notice writing in red that says, "Come find me, I'm in your closet." And they're horrified because now this is like confirmation that this thing is screwing with them. It's not their mother. And it's now interacted outside of just tapping. It's actually writing on the walls. And so the girls run out of the house because this feels like a threat. They felt threatened by everything that was happening before, but it was almost like the writing on the wall was a step over the line. This felt like a direct, intentional threat towards the girls, kind of absolutely taunting them and scaring them. So they run out of the house. Their father was not there, he was working. And so the girls ran next door to their neighbors and said, can we stay with you for a minute? Something weird's happening in our house. They began to get into the weird writing on the walls, but didn't really go into too much detail. And the neighbor said, we're just gonna wait for your father to come home before we do anything. And so the girls stay with the neighbor. Brian comes home. As soon as they see Brian pull in the driveway, they flag him down. He comes over to the neighbors. Neighbor pulls Brian aside and says, here's what happened. They came over here. The girls are hysterical, and they tell their dad that there's writing inside the house. And so Brian, his first reaction is, this is out of control now, guys. This is too much. He goes over though with them to the house, and he goes into the basement and he sees the writing on the wall. And his thought is like, now you guys are, defacing our property to live out this kind of fantasy. And so this for him was the line in the sand that they've now crossed. It's now getting totally unhealthy, and he ordered them to go see grief counseling. So that actually began at this point. Several weeks would go by with no tapping, no anything, just silence in the house. It was almost like whatever this was had stopped. Then one night when Brian is working late into the night once again and the girls are alone, they're in the front room together and they're just sitting there. It's been nice having a couple weeks without any strangeness in the house. And they start hearing tapping from somewhere else in the house. And they get up, they kind of creep their way over to where they think they're hearing it, and it's coming from Annie's bedroom. When they go into Annie's bedroom, written on the walls is, "I'm back, find me if you can." Just like the last time they saw writing on the wall, they run out of the house. They flee the house, they go to the same neighbor's house, and they say, "It happened again. You gotta believe me, it happened again." The neighbor says, "Stay with me, we'll wait for your father again." Father comes home, same situation plays out. He gets flagged over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor says, "Hey, they're back again," with the writing on the wall. And Brian's mad. And he says to the girls, like, "I put you in counseling. I'm telling you to stop doing this. Like, this isn't okay. It's not healthy." And he tells the girls and the neighbor to stay here. I'm gonna go in that house and I'm gonna search the house top to bottom to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of in that house. And so he goes back to his own house, and when he opens the door, the house is in total disarray. It's like someone had ransacked the house. And he's thinking to himself, the girls didn't do this. Someone else did this. And so now he's on edge. And he walks through the house, he's not hearing anything, and he goes up to Annie's bedroom, and he sees the writing on the wall. And then he looks, he sees a man standing in the closet wearing women's clothes, which would turn out to be his dead wife's clothes, wearing a wig, carrying a hatchet. And this man in a dress is staring at Brian, and Brian's startled. The guy starts running out. Brian tries to grapple and fight with him, but the man in the dress manages to run past Brian out into the rest of the house. Brian is like so caught off guard because this guy's got a hatchet. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He starts chasing after him, but the guy's gone. Brian's looking in his house, but finally Brian just leaves the house because this guy's got a hatchet. He runs outside, he runs over to his neighbor's house, and he's like, call 911, there's somebody in the house. He makes sure his girls are okay, he stays with his neighbor, calls the police. The police go in, and they look everywhere, and they can't find anything. And they say to Brian, like, I'm sure someone was here. It's a very convincing story you've just told, but they're not here now. And unfortunately, all we can do is tell you, you probably should not be here right now until whoever this was is caught. And you should stay with some relatives. We'll watch the house, we'll see if anybody else comes back, but there's not much we can do. And so unfortunately, the girls and the father are left with no answer to what was going on or who this person was. And Brian's thinking to himself, like, how did he get away? How did this guy in the dress get away? Like, how did that happen? I mean, they're searching the neighborhoods. He's wearing a pretty distinctive outfit. How did he get away? And so for 2 weeks, Brian and his daughter stayed with some family. But in those 2 weeks, no one found out who this guy in the dress was. I mean, Brian and the girls are traumatized. Brian feels like this horrible father, that I've left my girls alone in the house over and over and over again with some crazy person with an axe in my house. I never believed them. What could have happened to them? It would have been my fault. And so it's a horrible time period. The girls are traumatized because now they realize they've been interacting with some crazy person in a dress with an axe in their walls. And it's just this horrible situation. But after 2 weeks, it's tough living with another family member. It's a tight place they're staying. And they decide, you know what? At this point, whoever that guy was, he must have ran away. We got police watching the house. Let's just go home. Let's just go home. We'll lock everything up. We'll get a security system. There's police watching the house. Let's just go home. And so they decide, okay, let's pack up and head home. And so as Brian is driving up his street, he looks at his house and he can see that there's a light on in the second floor. And he's thinking to himself, like, I thought the police were just watching it from the outside and just kind of patrolling the neighborhood. I didn't know there'd be police inside my house. And as he's looking up at the window, about to pull into his driveway, he sees the guy in the dress suddenly walk across the window. He sees him clear as day. So he stops what he's doing and he calls the police. Police are there in a second. The house is surrounded. So with the house surrounded, police finally go inside. Now, no one's been inside the house since Brian and the girls left. They locked it up and they were monitoring it. There was no police inside the house. There was nobody inside the house, supposedly. The police, when they open up the door and go inside, the first thing they notice is not only is all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place, but there are pennies glued to the ceiling. All these pennies glued to the ceiling. And there's red writing all over the house, on all the walls and weird places, just writing, strange cryptic writing. But they search the house and they don't find anything. But one of the officers who was down in the basement at one point noticed that there was a little piece of wood covering up what looked like a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. And he found that he could very easily move aside the washer and the dryer. And there was this board that when he pulled it aside, it was the entrance to a crawl space. In the crawl space, they find that someone had kind of burrowed between all of the insulation all around the house into all the walls. And there were these little peepholes in all the different rooms that whoever was in the crawl space could look into any room at any given time. And as they're searching this intricate crawl space that spanned the whole house, they find Danny LaPlante, who was this totally deranged teenager who had briefly dated Annie. Annie had broken it off with him, and so he had snuck into their house and had been living in their walls, listening to their conversations, had heard about Annie's mother passing away and had kind of adopted this "I'm gonna pretend to be your dead mother" routine, and had been writing in ketchup on the walls and tapping it. He had watched them do the seance, and so he had all this stuff to work with to really spook them, and had been sneaking out and moving furniture around and sneaking back into the walls for months. And that's not even the worst of it. Danny LaPlante, after he was brought out of the crawl space, was arrested and then put into a juvenile detention center. And then when he got out of the detention center later in 1987, for reasons that no one understands, I don't even think Danny understands. He broke into someone's house and murdered almost an entire family in cold blood. I don't know about you guys, but the idea of somebody living in my walls for 2 months doing anything is horrifying, let alone being Danny LaPlante, the psychopath that he was. But what really trips me out is when the police went in that second turn, when they had the house surrounded, and they find pennies glued to the ceiling and writing on the wall, and then they find him in this intricate crawl space. Like, that's straight out of a horror movie that wouldn't be scary because it's just too many weird elements. But it happened. And I just think about the trauma that the Andrews family undoubtedly has suffered, not only the loss of their wife, their mother, but imagining what could have happened to them, because Danny would go on to murder almost an entire family. And it just as easily could have been them. And so I would imagine I'd be shocked if they ever got over it. That's a deep-seated trauma that, I can only hope that they were able to recover from. If you enjoyed this story and you want more content like this, if you would, please gently pulverize the like button, and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my weekly 3 to 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, message me on Instagram. My handle is johnballen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballen, same as my YouTube channel. And I go live 3-4 times a week on TikTok as well. So I hope to read your comments and see you on other platforms. And until next time, that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much. Take care. At 4 a.m. on February 25th, 2022, a 36-year-old father of 3 named Christopher Boudram woke up inside of his modest home in Pointe-à-Pierre, which is a city on the Caribbean island of Trinidad and Tobago. After quietly getting out of his bed so as not to wake up his wife, who was still asleep, Christopher walked into the other room and did his typical morning exercise routine, and then afterward, he made himself some breakfast in the kitchen, and by 5:30 a.m., he was out his front door, into his car, making the commute to work. Christopher was a professional scuba diver, and he had been for over 10 years. Commercial diving is a very broad field to work in, but generally it meant that Christopher was paid to do various tasks underwater, things like inspections or welding or just moving equipment around. For the last 8 months, Christopher had been fortunate enough to be working for a company that was located just 2 minutes' drive from his house. It was an oil and gas company called Perea Fuel. And Christopher's duties at Perea Fuel centered primarily on the upkeep and maintenance of several of these underwater pipelines that Perea Fuel used to get the oil off of their ships and onto land where it could be processed. These underwater pipelines, of which Perea had at least 6, were basically U-shaped. They had these 2 vertical sections on either end that would jut out of the water. And then connecting these 2 vertical sections was a 1,200-foot long section of pipe that ran along the seabed at roughly 60 feet below the surface. And so one of these vertical sections was out at sea, so 1,200 feet off the coast, and ships would literally come by this opening to the pipe that was out of the water, and they would dump their oil into this opening. The oil would go down, it would shoot across this long horizontal section, and then go up the other vertical section much closer to shore, where workers could collect the oil and bring it onto land to be processed. So on this particular day in February of 2022, when Christopher arrived at Perea Fuel, he was not surprised at all to find out that he and his diving colleagues would be doing some maintenance on one of these underwater pipelines. However, there was something unique about the particular pipeline they'd be working on. It was called Berth Number 6, and unlike the rest of Perea Fuel's underwater oil transport pipelines, this one had not been active since 2018. So for the past 4 years, it had just sat idle. Now, this was on purpose. For whatever reason, the company had decided not to use Berth Number 6, and so they put it into a sort of storage mode, where the vertical section of Berth Number 6 that was out at sea was untouched. It was still just poking out of the water, no changes.
However, the other vertical section of berth number 6 that was closest to shore was first plugged up, like imagine putting a cork inside of a wine bottle. That's basically what they did to this vertical section, except they used this huge inflatable cork. Imagine like a huge pool toy. They basically jammed it inside of the vertical section, and then they inflated it so much that it was completely airtight inside of this pipe. And then once it was all plugged up, they submerged this section of the vertical pipe underwater, maybe 5 or 10 feet below the surface, to kind of keep it out of the way of all the ships that would be moving around close to shore. And then also what they did is they put something called a habitat on top of the opening of this now submerged vertical section of berth number 6. To understand it, you got to picture something else. Okay, so imagine you're in the bathtub and you have a bucket, and you flip it upside down above the surface, so there's nothing inside of the bucket, and you just take the bucket and push it straight down into the water. No matter how deep you push that bucket, as long as you don't rotate it to one side or the other and you just keep it steady, that air pocket inside of the bucket will remain. You can literally reach your hand under the bucket underwater and it will be dry. And so basically that's what this habitat was. Korea Fuel took a huge bucket, if you will, and they lowered it straight into the water and pressed it down and anchored it right above the opening to this submerged vertical section. So there was a permanent air pocket over the opening to this pipe. And the reason for this is because if they needed to do work on this pipe, like for example, today they wanted Christopher and his colleagues to make this pipe active again, which meant doing work on it, the divers could swim down, get inside of this habitat, stand on the little metal platform they put in there, and then they could take off all of their cumbersome diving equipment and just work on the pipe while breathing air. It was really kind of a luxury. And so after Christopher and the 4 other divers he'd be with that day got their instructions, to get berth number 6 active again, they began getting all their gear together and going over who would be responsible for what once they got down to the habitat. And then once they were all ready, they made their way out to the boat. The 4 other divers that Christopher would be working with that day were men he had worked with many times before and men he would consider his friends. Their names were Kazim Ali Jr., Yusuf Henry, Faisal Kurban, and Rishi Nagasar. Once their boat had moved just off the coast and had stopped kind of roughly over the area where below the surface was this submerged berth number 6 vertical pipe and the habitat, the divers hopped off the boat and they swam straight down. They went up and under the side of this habitat wall and they entered into this breathable airspace right around the entrance to this pipe. And so they climbed up onto the platform, they took off all of their gear, and then once they were just in their wetsuits, they got to work. Now, the job was relatively straightforward. They just needed to basically pull a lever inside of the pipe that would then deflate the big inflatable plug that had been set inside of this pipe to seal it. However, when one of the divers reached down and began to pull on the lever, it was jammed, and so they needed a wrench to kind of free the lever. And so Kazim volunteered to go back to the surface and get a wrench because no one had one inside of the habitat. And so Kazim put his dive gear back on, he dove out from underneath this habitat, swam back to the surface, he talked to the folks on the boat, they handed him a wrench, and then he swam right back down, back inside of the habitat, and then once he poked himself back up, he handed the wrench up to the nearest diver. And that diver took the wrench, he turned back around to face the pipe, he reached down inside, and he began fiddling with the lever, and eventually he freed it. However, the second this lever was activated, something horrific happened inside of that space. Know exactly how this happened or what exactly could have been done to prevent it, but in short, the second that lever was activated, it began to deflate this big cork that had been plugging up this inactive pipeline for the past 4 years. And when that happened, it broke the seal, and suddenly all this low pressure air that was sitting in 1,200 feet of pipeline made contact with the extremely high pressure air that was inside of this habitat. And air likes to go from high pressure to low pressure. And so the second that seal was broken, the high pressure air in the habitat expanded down into the pipe. But this happened so quickly. It was almost instantaneous. It was almost like the pipe opening became the world's strongest vacuum, and it sucked everything inside of the habitat, all the air, all the equipment, all 5 men into the pipe, and it also began sucking in seawater. Basically everything was going in this pipe. And so these 5 men, they don't have their scuba gear on, went from just standing outside the pipe to feet first flying into this pipe with all of their heavy equipment all around them, and there's seawater all over them. They're holding their breath, and so they get sucked down the vertical section, they turn the corner, and they get rocketed out to sea. They are on the 1,200 foot long section, the horizontal section, just blazing a trail. Now think about this. All 5 of these guys have no idea what's happened. They're on a breath hold. They are shooting down a pipe. They can't see anything. The space inside of this pipe is so narrow. It's 2.5 feet across. And so they're getting compressed. Their shoulders can barely fit inside of this pipe. And so you gotta figure that all of them are expecting to die. But eventually the pressure in this pipe did equalize, at which point this vacuum phenomenon stopped up at the habitat, and actually the habitat kind of refilled with air. And when that happened, all the seawater that was getting pulled into this pipe also stopped. So no more air, no more seawater is going into this pipe. It's kind of like whatever went into the pipe, that's what's down there. And when this equalization happened, these men, who by this point are on a several minute long breath hold, they eventually begin to slow down and come to a stop. And by some miracle, they came to stop in a section of this horizontal pipe that was not totally flat to the seabed. It was slightly elevated, which meant there was a small air pocket where they stopped. And so they come to a stop and they just start gasping for air, and then they begin yelling out to each other, and they realize all 5 of them are alive, and they're all kind of roughly grouped together in this air pocket. And we know this because one of their cameras on their bodies was rolling when they were pulled into the pipe. And so we can't see anything because it's pitch black inside of this pipe, but we can hear them talking to each other once everything stops. And so over the course of this kind of chaotic initial volley of communication up and down the pipe, where again, these guys are on their backs, they can't move at all. They're completely kind of trapped in position. And even though they're in an air pocket, there is water kind of close to their face. And so they have this little area to breathe in. They're panicking, they're screaming at each other. But in this volley, they're able to figure out that Christopher was the closest to the way they had come into the pipe, meaning his head was closest to the vertical section closest to shore, and all 4 other men were right below him. And so Christopher knew if they were going to get out, their best chance was to backtrack, head towards the way they came in, which meant Christopher would have to lead them. And so Christopher kind of found it within himself. Again, we can hear him on audio, and he told the others to calm down and link their feet onto the person below them's shoulders. And so to do that, the only way these guys could move in this tight little pipe is just by pushing with their heels. And so painfully, slowly, these guys were very badly battered at this point. I mean, they came flying in here surrounded by all their heavy equipment crashing into them. Guys had broken bones. They were really badly beat up, but they finally make their way until they're all linked, feet under each other's shoulders. And then Christopher, in the lead, began kind of going in reverse, inching their way up the pipe back towards the way they came in. Now, the reason they felt strongly that they needed to act right away and not wait for rescue is because they didn't really understand how this had even happened. They didn't know if at any moment more water was going to pour into this pipe. They also understood that there was limited air, and at some point they would suffocate. And so with that in mind, they begin this journey. And right away, Christopher reaches the first flooded section of the pipe. Now, you have to understand, they have no idea how long this flooded section of pipe is. And so once you start moving into this flooded section behind you, once you go underwater, you're either going to find another air pocket at some point, or you're going to drown. And so it would turn out that only Christopher and the guy right below him, Faisal, were willing and physically able to attempt this potential suicide mission. And so the others, they began panicking. The others who were not going to go, and they're screaming out for Christopher and Faisal not to leave them. You can hear it on audio. But Christopher and Faisal, they felt strongly that somebody has to go to the surface and get help. And so Christopher and Faisal, linked together, begin inching into this flooded section of pipe. Pitch black. They have no idea what's going to happen. They're slowly going under the water, and they just begin inching their way on a breath hold. And by some miracle, this first flooded section they entered into was not very long. And so both Christopher and Faisal were able to barely, coughing and gagging, get out the other side into yet another air pocket. And by an even bigger miracle, in that new air pocket, Christopher, above him, he managed to get one hand above his head, he felt scuba tanks, 2 of them. And he was able to take one of them and somehow force it past the side of his body down to Faisal. And so both men suddenly had an air tank. Now they had to kind of awkwardly pin the tank above their head. These tanks are not light. If you've not scuba dived, it's like pushing a pretty heavy weight. And they had the regulator, so the mouthpiece that actually gives you the air in their mouths, but they couldn't really hold the mouthpiece in place. It was this very awkward thing they were going to do, but this meant they could now enter much longer flooded sections of pipe and potentially make it out the other side. And so, with their air tanks on top of their heads and their mouthpieces in their mouth, gripping down as hard as they can with their teeth, they continued to inch along with their heels, and they entered into more and more of these flooded sections of pipe. As they're doing this, they know they have a scuba tank, but they have no idea how much air is in these tanks. They can't see the gauge. And so it's kind of the same thing as going in on a breath hold. You don't know when you're going to run out of air because you don't know how long these flooded sections are. So you can only imagine how terrifying this must have been. But they kept on going, and finally, after hours of this, that Christopher and Faisal are going through these terrifying stretches of, hoping they can hold on to that mouthpiece and hoping they got enough air. They'd get through these flooded sections, hit the next air pocket. After hours of doing that, they reach this air pocket where Faisal starts to kind of lose it. And he starts yelling to Christopher in the total dark to stop, but he didn't have a reason, and Christopher could kind of sense that, Faisal is starting to lose it and we're running out of time here. And Christopher, he can hear the other divers that they had left behind in the beginning screaming out all the way back down the pipe. And so Christopher, he stayed composed and he tried to get Faisal to calm down and come with him. But when it was clear he wasn't going to, he told Faisal that, hey, I'm going to keep going alone then. I'm going to get us help and I'll be back for you. And so Faisal, he was still panicking and he yelled at Christopher not to go any further. But Christopher knew he had to go. And so with the sound of his friends screaming out for him to stop, Christopher again cinched down with his teeth on the mouthpiece, continued to push this air tank above his head, and he inched his way closer and closer to the entrance of this pipe. And after reaching a very long underwater section where he knows he's running out of air, his tank hit the kink in the pipe where it went vertical again, which meant right above him was the exit. The habitat is right up there. And so Christopher was able to kind of turn and swim up this vertical section until he popped up. And it was again another air pocket, except the water level in this vertical section was not close enough to the exit of the pipe to actually pull himself out. It was like Christopher was stuck at the bottom of a well, like there's nothing he can do. But luckily there was a chain that was dangling down in arm's reach. And so Christopher grabbed the chain and just had to wait, having no idea if anybody was coming to get them. But eventually 2 rescue divers did get into the habitat and they reached down and they pulled Christopher out of the pipe and they saved him. And when they brought him up to the surface, Christopher saw that Perea Fuel had their emergency response team on site. The Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard was there, and it's clear they're getting ready to do some sort of rescue operation. And so Christopher, who's totally traumatized, he's badly hurt, he still ran up to authorities and told them, all 4 of my colleagues are still alive. I heard them banging in the pipes. I know they're in air pockets. You got to go back down. You got to save them. But ultimately, the authorities decided it was not safe to send rescuers down into this pipe. And so when Christopher found out they were not going to try to rescue his friends who are literally banging the pipe, he can hear them, he tried to jump back in the water to do it himself. And they stopped him. And then Christopher was rushed to the hospital where once he was admitted to the intensive care unit, he tried to check himself out to go back to the water to save his friends. But again, Christopher was stopped. For 2 whole days after Christopher was rescued from this pipe, his colleagues, the 4 other divers, remained trapped in the most claustrophobic, horrible situation imaginable, and they continued to bang on the pipe and make noises that could be heard on the surface. but nobody did anything. And so finally, on February 27th, the noises stopped inside of the pipe because all of the men died. They either died of suffocation because they ran out of air in the pipe, or they died from one of their injuries, or they attempted to do one of those long underwater sections of pipe on a breath hold because they didn't have scuba tanks, and they drowned. On February 28th, 3 of the divers' bodies were recovered, and the final body, the 4th diver, was recovered on March 3rd. It's unclear why Christopher and the other divers did not do something to equalize the pressure inside of the habitat and inside of this pipe before undoing the plug, because this vacuum effect, which is known as delta P, is actually easy to anticipate and relatively easy to prevent. But the investigation into exactly what happened and who is to blame is still ongoing. However, the only survivor, Christopher, and many other people who are following this case, they believe the 4 deaths are directly attributable to Perea Fuel, who were primarily responsible for not allowing a rescue operation to happen in those first 2 days, where you could clearly hear the sounds of these divers banging on the pipe. And so to finish this story, I'm going to show you the final footage taken by one of the divers, Kazim, who was the one who got the wrench and brought it back inside the habitat, handed it off, and then that wrench was used to push the lever, which created the vacuum. You'll see in this video that it looks like nothing is going on, and Kazim is just inside of this habitat and all the divers are fine, and then it's like his camera just turns black. What's happening there is he was pulled so quickly into the pipe that it looks like it was a cut of the camera, when in reality, that's just how fast everything inside of that habitat was pulled into the pipe. This video is highly distressing. Viewer discretion is advised.
So just a couple of weeks ago, early on July 24th, 2020, an 18-year-old woman named Gia Fuda, who was living with her parents in Seattle, Washington, wakes up in their home, goes downstairs, says good morning to her mother and to her father. She has a sip of a seltzer water, and then she heads out to her car and says, okay, I'll see you tonight, and she drives off. Gia's mother said that because of the quarantine, all of Gia's college classes had been moved online, and Gia didn't like doing all of her work in the house. She felt trapped. And so her routine consisted of getting up early and heading to Bellevue College, which is just outside of Seattle, where she could do some work in their library, do her online courses there, and then come back sometime in the evening. And so Gia's parents assumed that's what she was doing that day. But when Gia left that morning, she did not follow her typical COVID-19 routine of going to Bellevue College to do schoolwork. Instead, she hopped on the highway and she drove 60 miles to a very rural part of Washington state. It's very heavily forested. It's called Index, Washington. And she gets picked up on a camera inside of a coffee shop where she gets a cup of coffee and she buys a Bigfoot keychain and then gets back in her car and drives another 30 miles away from Seattle, away from her parents' home. It's unclear where she's going until her car runs out of gas. And when she ran out of gas, it was like she wasn't prepared for it because she was only able to turn her car and barely pull off of Highway 2. It didn't look like she'd intentionally parked. And it's actually how investigators spotted it because it was jutting out into the road slightly. She gets out, and instead of walking on the highway to try to get help or trying to flag down another motorist, she grabs her cell phone, her Bible, and a journal and turns and starts walking directly uphill. There's like this mountain right next to the highway, and it's very densely forested. And she just starts walking straight up this mountain. It's important to note that David Paulides just recently came out with a video about this case on his Can-Am Missing Project channel, and he says that the area she stopped in is an area where at least a dozen other people have gone missing under baffling circumstances that have all been covered in the Missing 411 phenomenon. By 11:30 that night, Gia's parents were starting to get very concerned that they hadn't heard from their daughter and that she hadn't come home yet. They started texting her and calling her. No answer, no response. By 1 a.m., they called the police. So this huge search is launched to go find Gia. hundreds of volunteers. They have all these professional search and rescue people out there. They have helicopters overhead. And almost immediately, within a few hours of the search being launched, they find her car on Highway 2. But no sign of her anywhere. The area that she was in was actually a dead zone for cell phone service, so they couldn't get in touch with her, in part because they had no service. And authorities weren't able to track her phone because there was no cell phone reception. So they didn't have much to work with, except that they generally knew where she might be, which is in this very thick section of the Cascade Mountains. And so for days and days, they're searching and turning up nothing. And unfortunately, as time ticks on, the likelihood of her being found alive is next to zero. But 7 days into this huge search where nothing has been turned up, they have this huge find. A couple of the searchers that were miles away from where she had gone missing. I mean, at this point, you're 7 days into the search. You have searchers combing miles and miles of territory, and there's nothing. They've found nothing. And these searchers are up near this scenic creek, where there's a little bit of a clearing, there's this creek, and they find in one area her jacket, her shoes, her phone, her journal, and her Bible, all in one area. It looked like she had just suddenly stripped everything she had, put it on the ground, but she was nowhere to be found. So while this find is certainly great progress towards discovering what happened, it unfortunately sent a message to her parents that at this point, you need to brace for the worst, because now your daughter is not only missing and has been for a week, she doesn't have any gear. She has no clothes, she has no phone, she's just gone and has nothing. So the omen was very bad at this point. But her family and the searchers were not willing to give up, so they continued to search this new area where all of her stuff had been found for another 2 days. And on the 9th day from when she had gone missing, they found her, and she was alive. She was sitting on a rock near this creek. When they approached her, she was very startled to see people coming near her. She clearly was not expecting to be found. She was also more or less incoherent. She believed she had only been out for maybe 3 days and just had gotten lost, but they told her she had been gone for 9 days. But she was unhurt. She had a couple scratches on her. She was definitely emaciated, but she had been drinking from the stream and eating huckleberries, so she was, taking care of herself, but she was totally confused. She didn't know why she was there. And when she was pressed a little bit further, she didn't know why she drove where she drove. She doesn't know why she walked up a very steep mountain into the Cascades. She also has no idea what happened over the first 6-7 days. She only recalled the last couple and thought that's the whole time she had been out there. So it's a very confusing story, and one that probably we will never get a clear answer to. This will just become another one of the thousands of very odd disappearances that occur all over North America, except at least in this case, she was found alive. Tom Mezek was this salty Army veteran. He had served in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is an elite paratrooper division. He taught survival training classes, but more than anything, he loved to hunt. And he actually hunted in this one particular area in New York all the time with the same group of friends. In fact, for like 55 years, Tom and his 6 hunter friends would hunt this one area. On November 15th, 2015, Tom and his hunting buddies decide to go hunt in this area. And they got a bit of a late start. They didn't get out there till about noon. So they decided, in order to make up for lost time, to use this technique that's referred to as a deer drive, where you have stationary watchers that set up on a line about 100 meters apart from one another, and you have a group of drivers that kind of corral any deer or any animals in the area and push them so that they go past the watchers who can take a shot at those animals. And so Tom, along with 3 other hunters, were made watchers, and they set up along this hillside where Tom was all the way on the left flank, which meant on his left were no hunters. He did have a hunter 100 meters to his right, and then there was 2 other hunters all the way up the hill on the right as well, but he was on the outer flank of that line. And the 3 other hunters that were going to be doing the driving were to his right as well. Behind this hill, they were going to try to push the deer up and over this hill down to this line of watchers. After 3 hours and no luck, they haven't seen one deer, they start to also comment on the fact that there doesn't seem to be any wildlife at all. No squirrels, no birds, no anything. There's just silence, which is very odd for this area. And when you consider that this group has hunted this area for 55 years, they have a really good understanding of what normal looks like. And before anything happened with Tom, they were already talking about how strange that was. Also, one of the watchers who was right next to where Tom was, about 100 meters away, he recalled hearing a very distinct sound, like a whooshing sound or a snapping sound, coming generally from where Tom was. But he didn't think much of it at the time. That is, until they got back to their cars after calling off the hunt because they had been unsuccessful, and everyone's there except for Tom. And they go back out, they're yelling for Tom, they're wondering, did he fall down? They're like, okay, let's radio him, because everybody had radios. There's no answer from Tom. They're searching the area where he was. They start shooting their rifles into the air. They can't find him, and they think, okay, well, we don't know what he's doing, but this guy is super competent. He was healthy. Let's just go to the cars and wait for him. And so they're sitting at the parking lot, which is not very far from where they were hunting. And this is an area they always parked in, and this is an area they always hunted in. So they knew that Tom knows where they're gonna be. And so they sat there waiting, and he's just not showing up. So eventually, the hunters call it in to the rangers that he's gone missing. A massive search is launched for Tom. I mean, they are combing this area. They got helicopters, professional search teams. They're looking in lakes, they're looking under logs, they're looking everywhere, and there's not a shred of evidence of Tom. They can't find his walkie-talkie, they can't find his gun, there's no clothes, there's nothing. He's just disappeared. On the 4th day of the search, the FBI shows up, and they get involved in the search, which didn't make any sense, because why is the FBI getting involved 4 days into a search for an elderly hunter where there's no sign of foul play? Why are they getting involved? It didn't really add up. And all they would tell Tom's wife is that they believed that something was off about this case, and that's why they were there. But they couldn't elaborate unless more information came in. But nothing ever shows up. Even though Tom was a bit older, he literally taught survival classes. He was the guy teaching other people how to survive in the woods. He also has been hunting in that particular area for 55 years. How is it that he in no way was able to signal that something was wrong, and that all these people, including the FBI, can't find any trace of him? It just seems like something is off. I gotta agree with the FBI on this one. In 2013, 51-year-old Dale Stelling decided to take a trip from Texas, where he lived with his wife and his parents, up to Colorado. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he had always wanted to go hiking and camping in Colorado. So he, his wife, and his parents load up the RV, and they start making their way up to Colorado. On June 9th, as they're making their way to Colorado, their RV breaks down in New Mexico. Even though they were eager to get to Colorado, Dale saw that where they had broken down was near the Mesa Verde National Park, and he thought, well, we weren't planning this, but let's just stay here for a night and go check out the park tomorrow. Then we'll get the RV fixed and we'll be on our way to Colorado. And so they all agree, they stay the night, and the next morning they head over to Mesa Verde National Park. It was a very hot day that day, and Dale's wife was overweight and not very healthy, and his parents were very elderly. So when they got to the park, they ended up just sitting at the visitor center, and no one really wanted to actually go walk around. But Dale was an avid hiker, and he didn't like the idea of just sitting around all day. And so at some point, Dale just says, hey, I'm gonna go stretch my legs and walk this trail here down to the abandoned city ruins. There was this city that had been built into the cliff that lots of tourists would go check out. And so his wife and his parents, they don't bat an eye. They say, okay, we'll see you in a little bit. And Dale was off. Dale made it seem like it was going to be a very quick trip. And so when he didn't return in 2 hours, his family decided to tell rangers and say, hey, you know, our husband, our son, he went hiking down that trail there towards the ruins, and we haven't heard from him. We can't get in touch with him on the phone. You know, can you guys go look for him? The rangers actually were not concerned at all. They said that we've never had anybody go missing for more than a few hours here. It's pretty hard to get lost. You know, there's lots of tourists here, well-marked trails. Just give it a couple more hours, and if he doesn't show up, then we'll go out and look for him. But after about an hour, and they still hadn't seen him, his family really pressed the issue with the rangers, and they would go looking for Dale. And of course, they can't find him, but they found a number of tourists that had seen him on the trail that he said he was going to be on. They had even talked to him. He was a very energetic, charismatic guy, and they would say that he seemed like he was just another tourist enjoying his time at the park. There's nothing odd about his behavior at all. And he was walking towards the area where he had told his family he was going. While that information was certainly useful, they still couldn't find Dale. And they were really fighting against the elements on this one. You know, the temperatures were over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and had been all day, and Dale didn't have any water. So they really had a limited amount of time to find him. So within 24 hours, there's this huge search that's launched for Dale. And interestingly, in the first 24 hours of the search, a woman was at the park and was walking along the trail that Dale was on. And she remembers hearing a weak male voice yelling for help. And so she kind of looked over the edge. She couldn't see down below her. She was on a bit of a cliff. Fearing that if she went to look, she might fall and become a victim, she went back to the rangers and said, "Hey, here's the area I was in. I heard someone yelling for help. You should go check it out." And the rangers said that actually we've been getting that report. We got that report yesterday. But when we went to look in that area, we can't find anything. There's no one over there. So while it seems very likely that that person calling for help was most likely Dale, we don't know for sure because they were never able to locate who was asking for help. And to this day, we have no idea where Dale is. There's been no shred of evidence to indicate where he went. He just vanished. If you enjoyed today's story, if you haven't already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their salt shakers with sugar. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. So I'd love to get your reaction to these 3 stories. What do you think happened and why? And I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon as documented by David Paulides, then you should check out David Paulides and his team at their YouTube channel, the Can-Am Missing Project. I've also provided links in the description below to all of their work. Also, I have a Missing 411 playlist that you can save and watch that as well. If you have a story suggestion for me to use on this channel, go to our subreddit, which is just Mr. Ballen. It's linked below. It's a place where you can drop your story suggestions. And if I intentionally use your suggestion, I will